In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Spraznikom. Oh, that was so weak. Spraznikom. There we go. That's much better. We celebrate today St. Nicholas. And there's a little facet of the life of St. Nicholas that maybe you're aware of, or maybe it's something you've read in the past and previously, forgotten or skipped over or whatnot, or just don't recall. But one of the aspects of the life of St. Nicholas is that before he was archbishop and after he was ordained, he went to the Holy Land and went to Jerusalem and traveled around there. And there were many, miraculous things that happened when he was there. For example, he went up, I believe it was, to the church on Mount Tabor, and the doors of the church opened for him. And there were these sort of things that happened that kind of accompanied his journey. What's interesting about it is, and this is what's pertinent to our homily today, which is that on his return, he greatly desired the life of being a hermit. This was actually the real desire of his heart, was to go and live in a solitude, in prayer and fasting. And so it was that he went away to a monastery and was basically living there as a hermit for, I don't think it actually tells us how long, but it seems to be kind of like a short period of time. And then he hears the voice of the Lord that tells him, basically, Nicholas, this is not the place for you to cultivate your salvation. Your place to cultivate your salvation is in the world. And so it is that he goes out of the monastery and back into the world. And I think this is kind of, how can I put it? It's kind of an interesting, almost you could say kind of peculiar turn of events, because, we know that from the writings of the Holy Fathers that oftentimes people who become monastics, they will have this temptation to go into the world and to be married. They'll go and they'll become monastics for a short period of time, and the devil will tell them, if you just went into the world, you could have a loving family and raise, godly children and do all these things, and your life would be so fulfilled. And so the monastics are often, you could say, tempted by this. And likewise, when the devil sees a married person who is, thriving in their duties, he comes to them and he says, just imagine all the virtue you could acquire if you had been a monastic. If you hadn't spent all this time raising children and doing all this stuff and all these things that are kind of quote unquote distracting you, imagine how close to God you could have become and whatnot. And you really should be a monastic. And so it's interesting that oftentimes in our own life, we have the temptation to do something other than that which God has allowed us or even called us to do. And many times, we have this understanding that there is, secretly that God's will is working its way out. I mean, kind of the foremost way to understand this or even to discover this is to pray that God would close the wrong doors in our lives and that he would open the right doors. And, there's a saying, rejection is God's protection. Rejection is God's protection. And so oftentimes God mystically and really in a secret way that still allows us to have free will, because this is part of his design, creating us in his image, is that he desires for us to make decisions. We're not robots and we're not zombies. We are human beings endowed with the gift of free will and of decision making. And God desires for us to use this to the fullest. And so what's interesting in the life of St. Nicholas, he's utilizing this and he's following the desires of his heart, and God basically turns him from the desires of his heart and says, I have something different for you to do. And so it is that St. Nicholas goes back into the world, back into living in basically in the, you could say, parish life. And then after the Archbishop, I believe his name was John, reposes, it becomes very clear, it's revealed that St. Nicholas, I should say that I believe it was when he was in the monastery, right, that when the Lord says this to him, he also reveals to him a gospel that is bejeweled, and I believe it's the Mother of God appears to him with an amaphorion, which is the basically the vestment that the bishop wears. It's his stole, basically. And so then he travels back into the world, and eventually, obviously, it's enlightened by the people that they want Nicholas. Everybody already knows that he's pious, that he's holy, and he becomes the archbishop. And what's so interesting about his life is that of all the different callings that he could have had and all the different things that he could have done, and we have numerous examples within the life of the church of different saints doing different things, like we know we have more homilies written by St. John Chrysostom than I think any other church father, right? And Chrysostom meaning the golden tongue, that he found his kind of life of salvation in preaching and teaching and giving homilies. Or St. Gregory Palamas, you can read the homilies of St. Gregory Palamas. I mean, they probably would take me an hour and a half to read them out loud. I mean, these massive homilies that he wrote, that he prepared for the people of Thessaloniki. And but then we see in the life of St. Nicholas, what is the kind of the foremost of his spiritual labors? It's his gift giving. It's the fact that he provided for people and that he struggled in asceticism in order to provide for others. It's so interesting because you see somebody who's so inclined to the solitary life of the hermetic life, the life of prayer, ascesis, the Jesus prayer, these sort of things. And yet his whole life is spent in service to other people and providing and taking care of other people. And then through that, we know him as this great wonder worker. And in fact, all these incredible miracles happen because of him. You know, there's numerous stories in people's lives. I would say, you know, of all the saints, he may actually be next to the Mother of God. There may be more stories about St. Nicholas in everyday people's lives than, you know, almost any other saint I can think of. You know, the stories of the work of Saint Nicholas are just numerous, even to our present day, even to our modern day. And I'll tell you one story because it always sticks with me, which was at the old cathedral in San Francisco. They call it the old cathedral. It was the original Rocourt Cathedral in San Francisco. There was an older Russian man who would come in, and he would come into the church, and the first thing that he would do is he would go over and venerate the icon of St. Nicholas, and then he would come over and venerate Christ, and then the Mother of God, or the saint of the day, Christ, the Mother of God. And now Bishop James of San Francisco told us the story back. He was a priest at the time, a hieromonk at the time, and he knew this man. And one day he went to him and he kind of said to him, you know, he said something along the lines of, when you come into the church, you know, you're really supposed to come and venerate the icon of the saint of the day, and then Christ and the Mother of God, and then other saints like St. Nicholas, you know. But the saints on the periphery of the church should be venerated afterwards. You know, he's kind of correcting him. And he says, my dear Father James, he goes, let me explain to you the story of my life. He says, when I was in Russia, I was in one of the gulags, and I actually escaped. I escaped one of the gulags, and I climbed onto a train. I was able to basically break free, climb onto a train, and was escaping. And I think it was on maybe even his journey out of the Soviet Union, or just maybe even to another part, but he was getting away from the prison camp. And he says, I was on top of the train, and he says that we were, as I was going, we were coming to a tunnel. And he says, I looked ahead, and I could see from the tunnel that I was not going to make it. It was going to crush me. It was going to kill me. And he says, I cried out to St. Nicholas. I said, Holy Hierarch St. Nicholas, save me. And I believe, if I remember the story correctly, St. Nicholas basically appeared in the sky. He saw St. Nicholas, and then he passed through the whole tunnel. And he goes, and so St. Nicholas saved my life on that tunnel from being crushed in the tunnel. I always come into church and venerate his icon first and give thanks to him for saving my life. So even in our modern day, even in our current times, we have so many of these stories that come about, or that kind of come to fruition by the prayers of the Holy Hierarch St. Nicholas. You know, that this wonderful intercession that he has before the Lord, and this way that he kind of, you could say, manfully bore the cross of his life, which was to be a hierarch, which was not the desire of his heart, but that he embraced it fully, and that he utilized his time to actually take care of and to provide for other people. And obviously we know numerous of these stories. It's not worth recounting, you know, with the stories of the virgins who needed the dowry and all these different things that he did in secret, providing gold for them and being able to keep the family in holiness. All these different things that he did were out of this kind of like selfless giving of his heart that he had. This is, you could say, the foremost of what we should be emulating when we think of St. Nicholas, and when we celebrate his memory, this selfless giving in the way that he embraced this life of ascesis in his generosity to other people. May we have the prayers and intercessions of the Holy Hierarch, St. Nicholas. Amen.